Why do games age? After thousands of hours of gaming, here are the reasons that I, Nisse, have found. First, aging visuals and The Last of Us 2. If we compare The Last of Us 2 to Tony Hawk's Pro Skater, most people would prefer the look of The Last of Us 2, even though you've never actually played the game and you may actually find Tony Hawk's more fun. This of course happens because we eat with our eyes first. And there was a time not too long ago when the prettiest game was usually the one that had the most money behind it and therefore was the most fun one, which is unfortunate because it makes publishers push for higher graphics even though there's nothing that makes a game age worse. And you can see it the clearest in the games that try to look the best. Grand Theft Auto 5 looked amazing on launch, but if you compare it to the other games now, I think it's aged the worst out of the entire series. The reason for this is reason number 2, style and Chrono Trigger. Games from the 16-bit era like Chrono Trigger really haven't aged since launch. The big reason for this is that it's heavily stylized. At the time, processing power was very limited, so the challenge was to create something that looked really good but could also be rendered by a very simple processor. These limitations immediately lent themselves to style, bright colors, punchy character designs, simple and interesting monsters. Despite the chunky pixels, you could show a game like Chrono Trigger to anybody and they would say this looks good, or at least not off-putting. But there's of course no shortage of examples of games that have aged just horribly. Let's start with a favorite category. 3. Early 3D and Resident Evil. Resident Evil is a series with some real video game titans inside of it, but it also has some examples of early 3D graphics that just don't really hold up. And because it's the first generation that tried to be very specific about capturing real life, the way the graphics differ from the real world become all the more noticeable. See also the Uncanny Valley. If you compare the first generation 3D to something around its own time, like Gen 1 Pokemon has aged a lot better because visually they were so simple that you had to play them with your own imagination, like a traditional card game. Some of the other contemporaries have also aged a lot better because, as we mentioned, they're very stylized. The original Spyro game has definitely aged with all those jagged edges, but then you look at some of the other games on the original PlayStation and you realize, I guess Spyro's aged pretty good. This presents the major problem with games aging. Some people out there feel a little more picky towards the games that they might play, and they might miss out on trying their next new favorite because they think that the game looks old. If you are one of those people who think a game can look too old, then let me tell you, buddy, that I respect that. I understand why you feel that. But it's literally just a gag reflex that you can get over. Kinda like when you get used to constantly being reminded to like and subscribe. However, there are ways to lube this process. Number 4. Recommending the sequel and Skyrim. The Elder Scrolls 3 Morrowind is a very fun game that looks like this, so it's understandably easier to recommend the sequels Oblivion and Skyrim. The problem then is that Oblivion and Skyrim are entirely different games with entirely different philosophies, and in the sequels you won't find the kind of writing that's put Morrowind on so many people's top games of all time list. So recommending a sequel could be a gateway, but there's no guarantee that you're gonna get the same experience. And this is why the Mario games always remix themselves between every iteration. Mario 64 starts out being a very clean and simple 3D platformer, but then Sunshine explores an entirely different direction using the jetpack, which is then remixed again for Galaxy when they bring in a bunch of gravity stuff. Because of this, Mario 64 has never been made redundant. You can always go back to it for that unique experience. Some developers, however, go the exact opposite route. Doom 1 and 2, Warcraft 1 and 2, Gothic, Age of Empires, Heroes of Might and Magic, Stalker. These sequels aim to be an objective improvement on the original game, and it's a classic and very safe way of making an objectively better sequel. This gets a bit questionable with games like FIFA, games that are released yearly specifically to make the last one obsolete, which pushes you into buying the new one every year. Hopefully this means that the next year's version is always going to be objectively better and port over all the good features from the previous game. However, this is EA we're talking about, so yeah, no. There are, however, more direct ways to tackle a game aging poorly. 5. Remasters and Dark Souls. A remaster can be a great way to tackle a game aging. You can update the visuals to make it look more approachable, fix little quality of life issues that kept people out of playing the original, and then make it compatible with the current generation of hardware. This is what Dark Souls 1 Remastered aimed to do. However, they also made some changes to the original game, which to some people made it not the definitive version, which in a way is going to make the game age even worse because now there's 2 different versions and new players don't even know which one to pick. This is probably why FromSoft decided to take down the original version of Dark Souls from the Steam store, which actually caused even more problems because it split the player base between the 2 games. Considering the complexity of both keeping a game experience intact and updating it for the modern crowd, it's understandable that some people go for the other alternative. 6. Remakes and Resident Evil. The original Resident Evil we mentioned is basically a camp horror B-movie, so when Capcom came in and remade it for Resident Evil HD, they gave it new voice lines, new graphics, new everything really. The problem this causes is that it's no longer the same game, not even close. Of course, this is for good and for bad. Maybe the new version took the original's ideas and themes and just executed them better, while cutting some of the stuff that nobody was gonna miss. The problem then is that it's hard as a creator to say what should be cut, because some players will always come back to older games specifically to play them for the imperfections that they love. An excellent example of this is actually the other Resident Evil HD remakes, which have specifically taken away that iconic loading screen door transition. This makes the game flow better, but it also loses just a certain something, you know? A certain magic. And speaking of exactly that magic, there are things that used to exist in games that we don't get anymore. 7. Manuals and Fallout. Fallout 1 and 2 have some of the best manuals for any game ever written. These manuals are survival handbooks issued by Vault-Tec, the corporation that's built the vault that you live in inside the game. A great example of this magic is that at the end of both of these manuals, there are recipes for the kind of food that they eat inside the Fallout world, which later has inspired Bethesda to create an actual Fallout-themed cookbook. You see, isn't that so cute? And it's worth asking how one can say little magical things like this without destroying a game's overall flow by, for example, forcing somebody to read a manual when they don't want to. It's a fundamental question of flow versus friction, and this is actually a perfect example of why games age. Summary: aging is ultimately about accessibility, and the reasons that games age is that eventually they get pushed over a threshold. Sometimes though, all you need is a simple update to pull some games from back over the threshold. We can't force a horse to drink water, but at least we can make the watering hole as nice as possible to drink from, although it is more difficult if the game mechanics themselves have aged. But that's a video for another time. Want more? Then click the funny buttons under this video. Since none of these videos are monetized, consider joining patreon.com/ns5e and click here for the best of Nisse playlist. Shout out the people who buy me groceries: Forge, Awan, Harry, Pumba, Omger, Egg, and everyone else on patreon.com/ns5e. Thanks, and thanks for watching.
The reason that white people are inferior is because they don't have enough melanin in their skin.